different now that the camera's on?
Well, the fundamental problem with the political system and the media debates right now is that media is a heavily regulated industry, as is telecom and cable. And if you grant political bottlenecks to essentially what are crown corporations, they will use their revenue streams to continue to bribe the political system through lobbying and campaign donations and think tanks and all sorts of other ways that they exploit corruption in our system. So the problem is not the policies and policy details or marketplace forces. The problem is that you have bad faith actors who are running these corporations, and the more power you grant them, the more revenue you grant them. If you grant them a dedicated revenue stream, they will simply use it to fight you in the courts, in legislators in the states, and they will break laws. They don't care. So, that's a very, very serious problem that cuts to the root of, we have this in other areas, but you essentially have corporate elites that are bad actors. And that's something that the only way to solve that is through public participation. And I think that's kind of the point of a conference, but also is to represent a movement of people that want to represent themselves and to literally take power from these sort of corporate elites who are basically right-wing socialists. There's no other way to talk about them.
Right-wing socialists, that's an interesting term. Can you define what you mean by that?
Well, if you look at, so I'm a blogger, right? And I write for, and I eat what I kill. Whatever advertising I'm able to sell, that's my revenue stream. It's a market of ideas, but it's also a market. And readers sometimes give money, but that's essentially how I support myself. I'm called a left-winger, a communist, an ideologue, whatever, a socialist. It's these companies that are getting massive tax breaks and subsidies from the government that are granted monopoly privileges or oligopoly privileges. They're the ones that are reliant on government handouts, reliant on government welfare, except it's just to sustain their power and their lifestyle and their ability to break promises at will. So when I say right-wing socialism, I mean it's a kind of greedy, protected status for this coddled, spoiled group of executives.
So they're not actually against state intervention in the economy. They're for it as long as it's the kind of state intervention they like.
Right. They absolutely hate genuine markets, and they like manipulated markets where they set the rules. So, it's a real problem, but it's kind of fun to make fun of them because they are weird. They're weird people too. Like Ed Whitaker, the CEO of AT&T, he owns a ranch, and the way that he relaxes, he owns a ranch in Texas, and the way he relaxes is to, apparently according to Businessweek, is to clear brush or destroy trees with a bulldozer. That's what he does for fun, right? These are weird people. They're not normal. And so, I've spent time with some of the younger ones, and they're strange. They're not in the cultural or political mainstream. And so, we're with the public, and they're just creepy, but they happen to have a lot of power. They just don't have any political legitimacy anymore, and we just have to point that out.
Let's talk a little bit about the sort of campaign for internet freedom, or whatever you want to call it, going forward. Free Press is or the Save the Internet Coalition has identified 3 goals going forward. And basically, we want an internet that's open, which means neutral, that's fast, and that's accessible. Let's tackle
and universal, I think is the most.
Yeah, well, let's use that term instead of accessible. Let's use universal. Let's talk about the first one, which is neutrality. We've won a couple of important victories recently. What do you think is important for us to focus on next in the whole neutrality battle?
Well, we have to go for a universal network. The big strategic flaw, and the one these companies can't fix, is that they don't want to serve customers that don't deliver them high margins. And that means that they can't deliver universal high-speed internet access. They just can't, and they won't. And what that means, they're morally bad people, but they will lie and tell you that they're going to do X, Y, Z, that their situation, the network they build is the best possible network. But the reality of it is it's not. And the reason that we're behind, say, South Korea in internet penetration and broadband speeds is because these people have refused to build the networks that they promised to build. And so what's really important for our purposes is to emphasize the principle of universality in broadband networks, because that's a very clear moral argument that says, look, these guys are simply acting in bad faith because they talk about wanting to deliver these great services, but then they explicitly exclude, say, rural customers from fiber optic networks. They explicitly exclude and have bad service in certain urban areas. They're not actually in favor of, they can't be in favor of universal access. It's not in their DNA. So just from where I sit, which is the political side, not the policy side, we have to push forward there, because that's the way to make the argument to the public that these people are taking what is essentially a public utility and denying it to certain people so that they can make more money. And then the other thing is it's not even that they're going to make more money in the long term. They're destroying their own companies. It's just a short-term game for them. I mean, these are executives that are, they're also ripping off their shareholders. Like, it's not like these aren't free marketeers in the sense that they're looking to build corporate value. They're not. They're just looking to build value for themselves as executives and rip off customers, employees, and shareholders, and the public. So we just have to keep pointing that out. And the way to do that is to point out what is possible, which is this very great, high-speed, universal broadband network that exists in other countries, and to actually put forward plans to build it and point out that these guys are just fighting it because they want a political bottleneck that they control for no other reason.
A lot of the people I talked to about this issue were surprised to learn that there even was a battle going on over the future of the internet. They thought that the internet is something that just kind of happens to you. It's just there, and somebody else decides, how fast it's going to run, what it looks like, and how it works. Is that the way the internet is, or is the internet something that is actively up to the people of the United States to help shape and make and determine the future of?
Well, I mean, it's a public utility. It always has been treated that way. It was developed by the federal government, and it's always. I mean, it's the definition of a public commons. We don't have a media that tends to report on issues of communications policy for a variety of reasons, but we also don't have a public that's used to engaging in arguments about communications policy or, frankly, politics. And this is for a variety of reasons. I wasn't used to public debate around politics until fairly recently. It's because of the internet that I came in. But it's absolutely a public good, a public commons. These corporations have public interest obligations that they've agreed to, that they've broken. And so absolutely the public has a right and an obligation as an aggregated group of citizens to look out for that.
My last question for you, Matt. What would you say to your peers or your colleagues, or maybe younger aspiring bloggers who'd like to be where MyBD is at? What would you say to them in terms of why they should care about the issues that you're talking about? They may have the attitude like, well, I'm new media, I'm not old media. Why do I need to care about what the FCC is doing or about these arcane media policies in Congress? What would you say to those folks?
Well, why do they need to care? I mean, what you're doing in blogging or in political activism is relating to systems of power. And so, these people are trying to exercise power over you, over, the public, over every person who's running a website or over anyone who's trying to organize against destroying a public park, whatever. So if you care about how power is structured in our society, you'll care about how we communicate. This specific issue, the details, the policy debates, I think it would be nice to know a little something about it. But what's important to recognize is that we have to fight these aggregated centers of economic power. Wherever you're fighting it, I mean, if you're fighting it in, say, energy policy, there's a different set of issues and a different set of people to know about. If you're fighting on transportation policy, it's a different set of issues to know about. But fundamentally, what we have to understand is that there is this interlocking set of economic interests, and whether it's energy policy, communications policy, transportation policy, any sort of large-scale policy where billions or trillions of dollars are at stake, we have to understand this interlocking series of bad faith actors who will and have ripped off the public and are incredibly selfish and destructive, and will eventually destroy this country if people don't stand up to them.
What's the Matt Stoller wish list for 2007? If you could have snap your fingers and make 3 things happen in terms of the direction of internet policy in this country in the coming year, what would your top 3 be?
Well, I mean, what I think is really important is not to enact new policies about. I mean, so my dream scenario would be, let's build a big universal internet access network that can deliver, television and 100 megabit connections to everyone in the country, and let's just get going. That's not going to happen. And Bush would, if you could get it through the Senate, which you can't, you probably can't get it through the House, it would still get vetoed by Bush. But that doesn't really matter, because what we have to do is the most important thing to do is to make the argument that such a policy and disempowering the telecom companies and the cable companies that rip you off, that make you come home from work if you want cable and stay there from 4 to 8 p.m., whatever stupid window they have, and then don't show up, that's a result of fundamentally bad people and bad political actors, and that they're holding this country back. And we have to make the argument that a better universal communications infrastructure can exist, should exist, and that if you want it, you need to vote for it at the ballot box in 2008. And that's what we have to do. We have to make that argument. And one of the things that I don't like that I'm watching right now on the progressive side is this notion that we should have muddled, kind of half-ass, half-a-loaf plans where we say, well, maybe we can try to get something through the Congress, as opposed to saying there are still fundamental disagreements about where we go. We're not going to get anything through Congress or local areas without the argument and without the public on our side. And we need to undergo a cultural change in our movement to understand that we have to make these arguments to the public, and we have to get the public to vote on these arguments about economic interests. We don't have to get them to vote on media policy, but we have to get them to vote on who they trust and general political and economic populism. So that's what I want to see happen.
Thank you, Matt. That's a great note to end.